Hey guys, Walt's here with a recap video for the most recent set of short stories we've been working with. And this will kind of sort of apply to that first set. So the first set of stories was Lamb to the Slaughter, The Landlady, and Prey. Two of those are on Common Lit. If you have not done the Common Lit assignments yet, you can go to www.commonlit.org and find them there. Get logged in. And I've also sent those home on paper. You can do them there. Now, the second set of stories was from a textbook, and I gave you PDF copies. You've got Astrologer's Day, Civil Peace, and Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket. So with each set of stories, we're focusing on plot, characterization, and setting and theme. And we're just trying to, and a little bit of tone. We're mainly trying to discuss basic elements of storytelling and see how they affect our experience as a reader. So the ultimate goal with each assignment was to have completed the CRQ assessment. And these each assignment it's 3 questions here, and the goal is to see if you can kind of talk about one particular literary element across 3 stories. So, like at this question right here talks about characterization. Compare each character's attitude toward life. So you're going to take the protagonist of Astrologer's Day, which the astrologer, the protagonist of Civil Peace, which is Jonathan, and the protagonist of Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket, which is Tom, and just compare and contrast their attitude toward life. Now, how do we talk about characters? This is where the character map comes into play. So after you read each story, I want you to write the name of the character in the middle and then give me descriptions of that character around the character's name. Don't focus solely on physical characteristics. In fact, most of the stories that we've read don't really give clear physical descriptions of the actual protagonists. Focus instead on personality traits. What kind of person do you think the protagonist is? Is the protagonist intelligent? Is the protagonist sneaky? Is the protagonist brave? Is the protagonist evil? Like, whatever. Just use adjectives that you think describe the personality of the protagonist. Now, to make sure you can go in and find evidence, I want you to give me 4 categories of support: actions, words, and thoughts. These all pertain specifically to the protagonist you're talking about. So if you think that Tom from Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket is a hard worker, if you think he is ambitious, what does he do that tells you that? What is your evidence? And for actions, you can summarize the actions. Just tell me in plainly, like, what does the character do? And don't just focus on the beginning of the story. Don't just focus on the beginning or the middle. Go all the way through the story, because a lot of times the way the character behaves at the beginning of the story changes by the end of the story. Think of characters as either flat or dynamic. A flat character or a static character stays the same throughout the story. Really, the only character I think we have so far that really stayed the same, the characters would be Jonathan from Civil Peace and the astrologer from An Astrologer's Day. They kind of stay the same, but Tom definitely changes over the course of the story. What does he do that shows us that? Words. These should be direct quotes. These need to be exact quotes of what the character says. So think about if you're thinking about Civil Peace, the main character there, Jonathan, has a very important conversation with the antagonist. In An Astrologer's Day, the astrologer has a very important conversation with the antagonist. Tom has a very important conversation with his wife. What are some words? What are some words that the character actually says that show who he or she is? Thoughts. Again, these should be direct quotes. But thoughts is tricky. We might not actually have like the narrator saying blah 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 blah, thought Tom. You might have to use some of the actual narration. The narrator will tell us what's going on inside of the character's head, especially in Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket. We get a lot of time in that story where the narrator is letting us know what's going on inside of Tom's head. So put direct quotes. What does the narrator tell us the character is thinking about? Words and thoughts of others. This is anything that another character actually says or thinks about the protagonist here. So think in Contents of the Dead Man's Pockets. There's only 2 characters in that story. You've got Tom and his wife Claire. But Claire says something to Tom that tells us about who he is. So you might not have this in every single story. You might not have, you'll have different combinations and amounts of each of these types of evidence. It's not going to be an equal distribution all the time. So if you really can't find evidence from a category, it might not be there. But I'm pretty sure in all of these stories, you can find at least one example of all of these, if not several examples of actions and words. Okay, now that's talking about characters. Let's go back here. This one deals with setting. Describe how each author creates a sense of place in the story. Cite examples from the story. So, setting and plot are interconnected. Where a story happens, oftentimes kind of dictates what happens in the story when you're talking about the customs, beliefs, and values of the people in a particular setting. So, let's talk about our plot map here. And let's talk about an astrologer's day. That takes place in an open air market in a 1950s-ish town in India. Think about the flea market in Crump, but like huge. And so, how does the author in the exposition give us a sense of place? Let's click over to the story here. So you've got this stuff. Um, Here we go. So the story. Oh, hang on. Okay, progress reports are out. All right, so I've highlighted stuff in pink here that kind of gets to the setting, and this is all taking place in the exposition. Remember, the exposition is where the author sets up the story, introduces the characters. There's no conflict yet. We're just getting the lay of the land. So look at all these details. Half the enchantment of the place was due to the fact that it did not have the benefit of municipal lighting. The place was lit up by shop lights, hissing gas lights, naked flares, cycle lamps, astrologers manage, so enchantment, ground nut heap, crackled, smoked. You're getting a lot of physical description. And in astrologer's day, the author uses the exposition to give us a whole lot of physical description of the place. Now, the plot map moves into the rising action. This right here, there should be a kind of a little corner turned right here, so to speak, where the conflict is introduced, and you have the rising action. What happens leading up to the climax, which is like the moment in the story. The following action and resolution sometimes take place over a longer period of time. I think back to Lamb to the Slaughter. Most of that story was following action. But when you think back to Prey, most of that story was rising action. So the following action and resolution, what happens directly after the climax, and then literally for the resolution, like tell me what the literal last thing is in the story. Now, theme just gets to a kind of a bigger meaning. What is a lesson that, maybe Astrologer's Day took place in 1950s India, but what can we apply from that story in 2020 Adamsville, Tennessee? And you got to have support. You can't just say the theme is like, love or fear or don't be mean or something like that. You got to give me support. Like what from the story makes you think that? All right, now foreshadowing and flashback. This is some fun stuff to talk about. The plot is more or less linear. It starts here and ends up here. Foreshadowing and flashback allow the author of the story to manipulate time, to take us backwards or forwards in the story without having to do like a time travel kind of thing. So with flashback, you want to find an example in the story where a character does something or talks about something in the past that has an impact on our knowledge of current events in the story. Did you get it worked out? Awesome. So you want to do something that, you want to show a flashback as an event where the character says or talks about or does something that has an impact on what's actually happening in the story. Now, foreshadowing, and this is tricky. I actually had a conversation with a student the other day. He couldn't find an example of like a clue in one part of the story that ended up being at the end. Foreshadowing is just where the author hints at something that's going to happen later in the story. It doesn't actually matter if that thing happens. I mean, have you ever watched a movie where they make it seem like the main character is going up the stairs and you think that the evil psycho Michael Myers killer person is at the top of the stairs and you think like you know what's exactly about to happen, but then it doesn't happen. The person actually doesn't meet the killer like that. It's getting close to Halloween. I'm thinking about scary movies. So this is going to be especially true for Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket. Right off the bat, look at that title, Contents of the Dead Man's Pocket. Like the author there wants you to think that there's a dead man somewhere in this story. So you're going to meet Tom, and the whole time you're going to be thinking to yourself, man, did Tom die? So you've got some physical description here of Tom, and that's important. In this story, the physical description of the character matters. It matters that he's a tall, lean, dark-haired young man in a pullover sweater who looked as though he had played not football, but basketball. Once you get into the action of the story, you'll see why it's so important that he was tall and lean. So scroll through here, pay very careful attention to the pink highlighted text, because this is another one of those stories where the author uses physical description to set the scene, to give us more information about what's going on in the story. And then civil peace. We haven't talked about that one a lot. This is a very straightforward story. There is a specific example of flashback at the very beginning, but really this is a story about a man who has endured hardship and trouble and is working very hard to provide for his family and make things as good as possible in a broken world. This is taking place right after a civil war. Peace and order have not necessarily been established yet, but Jonathan is trying to do the best he can with what he has. So I should have had some highlights. There we go. So this story doesn't rely on a whole lot of physical description. In this story, the author uses dialect and conversations to bring us into the setting. So here you have the protagonist, Jonathan, speaking with a someone that's come to his house, and he says he's a thief, not thief man and in people, make you open the door. So we get a clear indication of dialect here. The story takes place in Nigeria after the Nigerian Civil War, and so you've got Jonathan and the thieves here. The thieves talk very differently than Jonathan, but in this case, his wife Maria actually begins to talk like the thieves are talking. So think about words that we have in the English language that we kind of made up or that we've put together. In class, we talk a lot about the word finna, like I'm finna go do that. So this is just a specific dialect, and you can tell a lot about a place based upon the way that people speak there. Okay, let's go back to these assessment questions and describe the conflict in each story. Cite evidence from the story. So I want to know, like, what is the major, when we talk about plot, the climax, like, what is the protagonist up against in each story? Who is the antagonist? What is the antagonist? Is the conflict internal or external? Think about Tom. Tom is out on a ledge trying to retrieve that piece of paper and contents of the dead man's pocket. Is that an external conflict? Yes, it is, because he is physically trying to battle the elements. He has to stay on that ledge. He has to fight the wind. He has to keep his grip on the wall. He has to break the window potentially because the window shuts behind him. But it's also internal. A lot of that story, a lot of contents of the dead man's pocket focuses on Tom's internal struggle, trying to keep his head straight, trying to keep fear from crashing in and debilitating him while he's on that ledge. So that's where you get the protagonist and antagonist on your plot map. Now, at the end of each of these stories, you've got questions to answer. And I'm looking specifically for the respond and think critically, the literary element, and the reading strategy questions. And this is the rubric that I use. So I assess the plot map and character map based on a 3, 4, or 5 scale. And same thing with the respond and think critically questions. So look over the rubric. Basically, to get a 5, you've got to have all of the elements of the map present, and I've got to show the map has to show clear insight into the story. You've got to take into account all parts of the story for each map and show that you've really thought it through and gone beyond just the basic part of the story and characterization. Respond and think critically. I'm not expecting paragraphs for each one of those. I do expect paragraphs for each one of these. These are like little tiny essay questions. This is where you get to flex a little bit. Give me a clear topic sentence. Give me the answer and the support in the body, and give me a conclusion sentence. The A and B here are meant to guide you. You don't have to have a paragraph for each one of these. You just need to make sure that the paragraph you have for number 1 answers these 2 questions. These should be pretty lengthy paragraphs. 3 sentences probably won't do it. You'll probably need 5 to 7, somewhere in there. So take your time on these. Really kind of explain how each story does this stuff. And it's your the respond and think critically questions that are just there for you to kind of think through the events of the story. So again, I'm not looking for paragraphs here, but I am looking for clear insight into the major events of the story and accuracy. So if you have here, do you think that the title of this story is appropriate, or would Civil War have been a better title? You can't just say yes, I think it is. You got to explain. Like I need to see your explanation based upon the events in the story. Show me you've been thinking about it. Okay. So if you are still working on these, great. Get them done by Monday if you can. If you are at home working on these on paper, get them back to me as soon as possible. This is our final little short story unit before we move on to a novel study, and we'll get all that kicked off on Monday. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Take care, and if you have any questions or concerns, shoot me an email at walze@mcnairy.org, or just ask the questions on the assignment in a private comment on Google Classroom. All right, guys, take care.